Welcome to another episode of the Chill by Nette podcast. This podcast is created for those who are passionate about their personal development, health, and well-being. This is a platform for you to come chill by my personal stories and weekly tips in becoming a better version of ourselves and to live a better present. But first, let's chill. My name is Jeanette. Welcome back. So I hope that you have been enjoying the series so far, and today we will be continuing our conversation around mindfulness. In today's episode, I will show you how mindfulness can help us experience our most difficult emotions, like pain, in a more effective way. And although I said that mindfulness is not all about feeling happy, it's not about feeling relaxed and joyful, but I think in times of experiencing difficult emotions like pain, grief, anger, or fear, I think mindfulness can help us feel better through the awareness we cultivate when experiencing these emotions. So when I used to stay in China, which was many years ago, I used to go through really cold winters. The winters are really harsh there, to the point sometimes my ears, my cheeks will feel rather painful, right? And I don't hate the cold. It's just that when I first experienced winter and when I'm going through the entire winter experience, I used to make remarks like, oh my God, it's so cold. I'm dying, and it's so cold. I can't do this anymore. And, my mind just keeps repeating these statements, sometimes without much awareness, because I think when we are going through certain difficult sensations, our mind just tend to generate all these automatic narratives around the emotional experience. And I think it's just natural as humans that we tend to do that, right? But one day I just learned to tell myself to stop telling myself anything and just pause and feel the experience for a bit without telling myself that I'm dying or I'm feeling miserable, right? Because when we are telling ourselves these narratives, these statements, we might feel more miserable than we actually are, right? So when I was mindful and I started feeling the air and cold on my skin, surprisingly, I felt better. Not to say that I don't feel cold anymore, or I don't feel the pain on my feet or my cheeks anymore, but I still do feel cold. I still do feel the sensation, but it wasn't to the extent that I was suffering or feeling miserable like how I told myself. So I think there is a lot of perception involved over here where we tell ourselves that we are in pain and we can't do this anymore. I think that inevitably create this negative feedback loop. So ever since then, I like to always share this story with my family members, right? Whenever they are complaining that it's very cold and they can't take it anymore, I just tell them to, release the thoughts in their head and just experience the cold and just let our mind quiet down without, judging the experience. And instantly, we might just come to feel better about the entire experience in a sense that we don't feel that cold anymore, right? And it works. It really does work. And, probably in the past, when I told this story to other people, I wasn't aware of the mechanisms behind it. But over the years, I come to see that, it's actually the narratives that we are adding to our emotional experience that makes it really difficult for us, or it just makes it worse than what it should be. So now looking back, I think what I was really doing at that time was separating the subjective experience with the actual experience, which is experiencing the cold. And yeah, I find that it always works, when we stop telling ourselves that we are miserable, we are in pain. I think letting our minds be free of those negative narratives do help to lessen the intensity of the emotional experience. Because what we are doing here is we are actually subtracting the negative narrative out of the actual experience so that what we are feeling is the objective experience itself. So this example here is trying to tell us that, being mindful of our actual experiences, right? That means approaching it without judgment, can actually help us to take any potential negative narratives out of our actual experience. And from there, we actually experience what it is and not what our mind says it is. Because we are just so prone to creating all sorts of narratives around our experiences that sometimes adds to our suffering when we do not have to, right? And we always have a choice. And it's true, sometimes I catch myself, telling myself, my God, I'm so terrible. Why must this happen to me? Why, right? We often have this kind of negative narratives happen inside within our head. Why must this happen to me? Like, why? It's not fair, I don't deserve this. So in a way, we are actually creating more suffering and putting more suffering and pain on ourselves than we ought to feel. So while being mindful does not always aim to bring us joy or happiness, I think it helps us to experience our emotions more objectively, and that means taking the unhelpful narratives out of the negative emotional experience such that we are just feeling the raw emotion itself. And in that process, we might find ourselves feeling better. So in today's episode, I also want to just go a step further to share a bit more about the difference between pain and suffering. Because I think a lot of times we use these terms interchangeably, but pain and suffering, they are not the same, right? And the difference between these two concepts lies in how we perceive the emotional experience. So the difference is, pain is very clean. It's simply an unpleasant physical sensation. And the thing is, all of us feel pain. Pain is unavoidable. We experience physical and emotional pain when we go through breakups, loss of jobs, relationships, or sometimes even just a flu can cause discomfort, which is also a form of pain, right? But then again, pain isn't bad. Every emotion is useful, and pain basically has its values as well. So it tells us what kind of situations we do not want to put ourselves in. And if we are pushing ourselves too hard, pain can also signal a sign for us to slow down or to take a break, right? Before we get even more pain and stress to the point that we end up in an injury. And emotional pain is the same as well. It tells us what is important. Imagine the departure of our loved ones often cause a lot of pain, and sometimes, these might come in the form of grief. And that's because we care for them. So when we see someone in pain, we feel pain as well. And, in that sense, pain also allows us to empathize with other people. So that is pain, right? But suffering is everything that we pile on top of the objective pain itself. It's a lot more complicated than pain. For instance, in my previous example, the narrative that I pile on top of the emotion pain is, I'm dying and I can't do this. Or maybe just to quote another example, when I went through my very first breakup, I told myself that this can't be it and it should never happen this way. And I told myself that, it's just wrong and I can never find someone else anymore. And yeah, I was basically going through one of my most painful periods during that point in time. And I think these statements that I tell myself, as you can see, doesn't really accept pain. And these are also the narratives that we just keep making up for ourselves. And they are just thoughts, right? And thoughts may not be true in any way, as what we have mentioned, but they can add to the emotional experience. And over time, when we pile all these unhelpful thoughts on top of the emotions, that is when we go into suffering. Even when we tell ourselves that, you shouldn't be feeling this way or you shouldn't be feeling that way, these kind of statements do add to the pain. And it's also the reason why, pain can end up in suffering. So simply put, I think the point that I'm trying to drive across is, pain and suffering are not the same. And the main difference is pain is what we experience because of something unpleasant that has happened, right? Which can be avoided sometimes. But suffering is what we create around the unpleasant situation by what we tell ourselves. And in that unpleasant situations, our mind is just more prone to coming up with all kinds of unhelpful narratives. And this is where mindfulness comes in, and mindfulness helps us to observe how our mind generates all these negative, unhelpful thoughts. And this is important because the longer the narrative stays the same, the more we tell the same things to ourselves. I think over time, we just kind of become the story that we keep repeating to ourselves in the form of, negative dialogues. So, on this note, I just want to introduce the ABC model. It's one of my favorite psychology models, and can help us to explain our emotions and why we feel a certain way, right? So A stands for adverse events. For instance, a negative event can be a breakup or a loss of a loved one, right? And B stands for our beliefs. Okay, beliefs here means the narratives that we tell ourselves. And C stands for consequence. So the consequence here is basically the emotions that you are feeling. So this model suggests that, A leads to B and B leads to C. And our consequence, which is the emotional experience that we feel, has a lot to do with our B, right? So when something negative happens, our emotion is dependent on our beliefs, which is the link between A, the adverse event, and C, which is the consequence. So for instance, when I fail a test, right, which is the negative event, how I view this event will have a very direct impact on my emotional outcome. So if I believe that, failing this test is a learning opportunity for me to do better in the next one, then I'll tell myself that it's all right. Probably we wouldn't feel so affected or sad. As opposed to if we think that we are a failure because we fail a test and there is no way to redeem ourselves, I think this inevitably leads to a worse emotional outcome. So knowing this, I just want to say that I think mindfulness is a way to help us connect from A to B in a more effective way. So whenever something bad or negative happens, let's remind ourselves to be mindful so that we don't create that negative narratives around our situation, around our unpleasant situation, which are most of the time far from the truth. So when we use mindfulness to connect from A to B, I think the beliefs and the narratives that we form are generally a bit more helpful. They tend to not be so negative. And that is where I see mindfulness fitting into the entire psychological model. And a negative emotional outcome doesn't only affect our mental well-being, but, in the long run, it may lead to more serious health issues as well. So it is so important that, we learn to protect ourselves from all these negative beliefs because, they do have a direct impact on what kind of emotions we produce and the intensity of it. All right? Yeah, so in a way, the entire point of this episode is to let you know that, pain doesn't always have to lead to suffering if we don't allow it to. And, like I always say, we always have a choice and, the power lies in our own narratives and what we tell ourselves. And that's why it's so important to, be kinder to ourselves and, to take note of the things that we are telling ourselves because they can become a reality. And to see these narratives, again, it goes back to engaging in mindfulness practice by connecting ourselves with the present moment and experiencing the experience for what it is without judgment. Pain and suffering don't have to go hand in hand. Pain is what we all go through, but suffering is optional. Thanks for chilling in. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe. You can also connect with me on Instagram at chillbynette, on my website chillbynette.com to join the conversation and access our show notes. Have a great day and we'll chill again very soon.